Hi everyone, my name is Julia and I'm here with Cassie and Evelyn to present on Sawtelle, Japantown today. So to give you an overview of our presentation, we're first going to cover Japanese immigration and look at it through a push-pull theory and a world systems theory. Then we'll cover the early history of Sawtelle, Japantown, the effects of World War II on this area, and what this area looks like today. So to begin with, we need to look at the push-pull theory to see why Japanese immigration occurred to America. So there were push and pull factors. So push factors are forces that drive people away. And in terms of these Japanese immigrants, they were pushed away by an unstable government, military occupation by Western countries, specifically United States and Britain. Men wanted to avoid the military service that was required in Japan at the time, and there were also high poverty rates. In addition, there were also pull factors, which are forces that help determine where people relocate. So Japanese immigrants were drawn to the United States because they wanted the opportunity to live the American dream. And many were farmers in Japan, so they sought out agricultural work in Hawaii and California since they had the skills already necessary to excel in those positions. And then in addition to the push-pull theory, we also need to talk about how these push-pull factors came to be. So looking at it through evangelization, militarization, and commercialization. So Christian missionaries first came to Japan in 1549, which led to Japan secluding itself during the Tokugawa period. However, in 1853, naval officer Matthew Perry sailed into Edo and forced Japan to open its ports to the United States, which ended this period of seclusion. And then also in 1863, British ships bombarded the city of Kagoshima over the death of an Englishman, and this allowed military forces to enter Japan. As a result of this military presence and unequal treaties that Japan was forced to sign, Japanese ports had to be open to Western countries, which allowed Western influence in and created the push-pull factors that were mentioned on the previous slide.
Yeah, so for some early history, during the 1860s, Japanese immigrants came to Hawaii and California. The Issei were the first generation of Japanese who had immigrated to the U.S. between 1885 and 1924 to be recruited as laborers and the results from the Chinese Exclusion Act. A majority of them worked as farmers or as gardeners because these were the jobs they were familiar with in Japan. While the majority of Japanese Americans lived on the West Coast, they moved to Southern California after the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 and also because of Southern California's cheap agricultural land. After that incident, approximately 1/4 of Japanese moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles. It was established in 1899 in West Los Angeles. Racially restrictive covenants in Westwood, Bel Air, and Brentwood led Japanese Americans to settle in Sawtelle. Thrived in the pre-war years and also in post-war time period during the 1940s and 1950s. Most recognized for having such a thriving Japanese American community. Had super busy restaurants, movie theaters, art houses, etc. Very strong roots in Japanese American history. Called the Japanese Ghetto, Japanese immigrants came and settled in huge numbers in the 1920s, lived alongside Mexican immigrants as well. Asian immigrants were not allowed to purchase or own their own land under the state alien land law. They normally found themselves working as laborers in bean and celery fields and also nurseries. People started to get worried because of how significant the name Sawtelle had meant. They started to call the area Little Osaka.
So now we'll cover acts of agency at the individual and community level. So as Cassie had mentioned previously, the alien land law didn't allow Issei or the first generation to purchase land in their name, but they were able to circumvent this by purchasing property in their children's name, who were American-born citizens. However, they were unable to obtain bank loans to buy property to start their family businesses or to buy their homes. So this forced the Nikkei or the Japanese American communities to develop a credit system called Tanamoshi, which is a type of community credit association where Japanese Americans would sort of pool any leftover savings they had, and people within that community were able to take that money out as needed. And then they were also able to create a closed loop economy within their ethnic enclave, which allowed them to get all their economic needs met without having to venture out into the dominant society, so they could avoid racism in that way. And an example of this would be the agricultural business, which I'll go into more. So as Cassie had mentioned as well, many of the people in this area were working as gardeners, and to be able to sort of have this business run, they needed a supply of plants, which led to the opening of many Japanese nurseries. So the nursery served mostly Japanese gardeners who worked in Beverly Hills and other rich white neighborhoods. And the nurseries could thrive at this time due to the Japanese American gardener population. And the suburbanization of LA created the demand for gardeners. And again, the gardeners needed plants and shrubs to fulfill their gardening duties, which the nurseries provided. And on the right, we can see the Equitable Nursery and the OK Nursery. And these have since closed, but there are still some nurseries in Sawtelle, Japantown today that are open. So like many other Japanese American communities, Sawtelle, Japantown also felt the effects of World War II. As we've learned in class, Executive Order 9066 forced all people of Japanese ancestry to relocate to incarceration camps away from the coast, and families had to quickly decide what to do with their properties. Some people sold it. They were not given fair prices for it, or others had trusted friends watch over it, which is what the Japanese Institute of Sawtelle did. They had the American Red Cross Association watch over it while they were incarcerated, and other Buddhist temples had overseers watch over these areas. So after returning home from the incarceration camps, the Japanese Institute of Sawtelle was given back to the community by the American Red Cross and was used as a hostel to greet Japanese Americans returning to the area. Newcomers were sent to the Kobayakawa boarding house or the Ota house. And these boarding houses provided areas where Japanese Americans could exchange information, get access to the Tanemoshi credit system that I mentioned earlier. And also it allowed younger Nisei to find spouses. And so as a result of this, many Nisei were able to reopen family businesses that catered to their community. So shops, markets, nurseries, eateries, restaurants, and sushi, ramen, and udon became favorites amongst Sawtelle, Japantown locals to eat at restaurants. And the resettlement years allowed for growth, which, as Cassie mentioned earlier, which is why Sawtelle becomes Little Osaka. However, the Sansei and Yonsei, which are the third and fourth generation, they obtained graduate degrees and pursued careers elsewhere, which eventually led to many Japanese Americans moving out of this area. So as the Japanese community moves out, it's important to preserve the history of Sawtelle, Japantown. So California Senate Bill 307 gave way to a process of preservation, which allowed language schools, churches, and cultural centers such as the Japanese Institute of Sawtelle to obtain funding and kind of be seen as sites of historical importance.
And I want to talk about the current issues that surround Sawtelle, Japantown. So one of the first ones would be gentrification, which is a form of urban renewal that occurs when urban neighborhoods experience shifts due to declining housing market and new incoming residents of different race and socioeconomic status. So the decline in Japanese American population in Sawtelle, so spatially assimilating and dispersing from traditional Japanese neighborhood. So as a result, the traditional establishments become less prevalent and there are fewer nurseries that can stay in business. And these businesses are becoming more corporate. So if we look at how we can help this, it would just be really buying from small businesses as well as installing historic markers. And then looking at population trends. So the data exemplifies the drop in the Japanese population, where white population has dramatically increased. Sawtelle was initially an area filled with Japanese Americans, but now Asians make up 1/3 of the population in Sawtelle residents, and has become more renter based over the year, which is 75%. And comparing the 2010 residents to the current year, most of the younger generation have moved out of Sawtelle. You can see this in the graphs. And then looking at Sawtelle, Japantown today and the characteristics that represent it. So it is represented by its Japanese American post-war settlers and their descendants. But currently, like, it is also characterized by its trendy shops and restaurants. So like coffee shops, sushi bars, and architectural art. So some of the examples that kind of make up Japantown and its specific like characteristics, like what make it unique. One of them would be like Coffee Tomo, which is a Korean Japanese based house roasted coffee. And they serve like honey butter bread and specialty pretzels with sweet potato or Asian red beans. They also have like a lot of sushi bars. So one of these would be Sushi Tejida, which is an authentic sushi experience. So you can sit at a bar or a table and it's an edome style sushi. There's also Giant Robot, which sells original Asian art and Asian American art. It originally began as an Asian pop-up culture magazine, then to an online store, and then a retailer in 2001. And then Blockhead Savory, which is a dessert place which has Taiwanese like snow cream, which is shaved ice. So those kind of the things that are very specific to Japantown that often bring people to kind of like try these different things. And then another distinct characteristic of Japantown is the sign itself. And this is a key aspect because Sawtelle has always struggled to gain its recognition that it deserves. And it was only in 2015 that they put up the blue Sawtelle Japantown. And this was like years long of effort to put up the sign. And it was significant because it does confirm their identity as Japantown. And as mentioned previously, it used to be called Little Osaka. And then there used to be 43 Japantowns in the state of California, and now there's only 3, and Sawtelle has established just 1. And then that's the end of our presentation. Thank you.